Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to be discussing a global ceasefire as proposed by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. At first, we had a resolution presented at the United Nations by France and Tunisia, and that resolution was not accepted, specifically by the United States, because it also mentioned the WHO. Now we have a proposal put forth by Estonia and Germany, which does not mention the WHO. There seems to be this scramble behind the scenes, at least at the UNSC, specifically about which kind of resolution really will go forward towards having a global ceasefire at this time. All of this, of course, in the context of COVID-19 and the need for countries, even those right in the midst of wars, to concentrate on defeating the pandemic that we're all facing globally at this time. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Serge, Stroobants, who is the Director of Europe and MENA region at the Institute for Peace, Economics and Peace, I should say. He's also visiting professor at Blanquerna University, Vesalius College, and Riga Graduate School of Law. He's joining us now from Brussels. Joining us from Dunedin in New Zealand is Richard Jackson, who's a professor of peace studies and director of the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago. Richard and Serge, thank you both for your time today. Richard, let me start with you. What do you make of the global call for a ceasefire? How important is that in the current context, and can that really lead to something more long-term, possibly?
Well, yeah, thanks for having me on your show. And I think, this is obviously a very important potential development. But, we have to be realistic. The United Nations makes these kinds of calls for ceasefires hundreds of times. It's done thousands of them over the years, and very rarely do they actually result in any significant action. Now, I think the different situation that we're in right now is that the whole world can see that we're in a pandemic situation. It's a crisis situation. There's genuinely, hundreds of thousands of people dying and the potential for millions of people to die. So that might be added kind of pressure this time to make the call for a ceasefire have some weight to it. But at the same time, we have to recognize that it's taken the UN, over 2 months to get to this point. We now have a second watered down draft. There's no enforcement mechanism within it, as far as we can see. So I think at the same time, we have to be a little bit cautious. I mean, we can hope that this is a situation similar to what we saw in Aceh after the tsunami in 2004, when, because of the disaster, it led to pressure that eventually led to a peace process that helped to settle things down. Maybe that will happen here. But in the first instance, what we really need is for the great powers, particularly the P5, to put aside their political squabbling and their, geostrategic maneuvering as if things are normal, and actually come together to make a strong resolution.
All right, Serge, what are your thoughts on that? Because we are in a world right now, Serge, as Richard there mentioned, where we talk about this grand idea of peace. But when it comes to implementation, that doesn't really ever happen, does it?
Well, I don't think so. I think the UN Secretary General has asked for a global ceasefire, but it does not ask for a ceasefire between the hegemonic power of the United States and the several superpowers that are basically in a confrontation with this hegemonic power, and that's not happening at all. So I think we are reviewing the rules of multilateralism, and body like the United Nations Security Council is also used as a rink for the confrontation between the United States and the other superpowers.
So if it's being used as a ring right now, then at this point, even in the midst of a pandemic surge, if we can't learn to work together, what hope is there for real peace around the world?
Well, I'm working for the Institute for Economics and Peace, and we have seen a decrease in peacefulness by 4% in the past decade. And this has mostly been driven by conflict. And this conflict was mostly concentrated in the MENA region, a region for which I'm also responsible, working here out of Brussels. And I think that's the reality. We did not really see an investment in peace in the past years, and we clearly saw a decrease in peacefulness over the past years. What I think is happening at the moment is non-liberal actors using a liberal system, a multilateral system, to also fight in any potential arenas their oppositions. That's what's happening at the moment. But that's nothing new. I mean, I'm a little bit older. I'm in my 50s already. So I grew up during the Cold War, and that same games over there during the Cold War, where opposing forces, of course, in the P5 were basically battling each other inside the Security Council also.
Richard, how optimistic should we be then about this sort of resolution right now? Because, it seems that even when it comes to this this resolution put forth by Estonia and Germany, even in this very watered down mode, even that is creating issues right now amongst the Security Council members. I mean, as I had put to Serge, if we can't agree to have a ceasefire just temporarily in the midst of a pandemic which affects us all, which knows no borders, that's quite a dismal situation, isn't it?
Yes, I think on the one hand, it is dismal. When we look at the actions of the P5 in particular, and the United States and China and Russia and so on in particular, they are acting as if it's business as usual, as if their conflicts are just continuing in a normal state of affairs. However, I think it's a mistake to be too pessimistic and to think that international politics comprises only of great power politics and, the UN Security Council. The reality that we've seen over the last 30, 40 years is the growth of civil society, the power of NGOs, the power of international public opinion, the power of social movements to really bring about huge geopolitical change through the force of nonviolent movements, for example, political movements. And I think even in this situation, what we're seeing around the world, despite the fact that the UN has failed to come up with this resolution for a ceasefire, we have seen a number of ceasefires undertaken by actors in local areas. Sometimes unilateral ceasefires, but in other cases, bilateral ceasefires. We've also seen a whole number of humanitarian organizations, civil society groups, and social movements jump into action to try and create more peaceful societies so that aid can get through, so that medical care can get through, and so on. So I think, at one level, we're seeing the failure of international governance actors, but at the same time, we have to put a lot of hope, I think, into the actions of civil society and ordinary people and people at the kind of NGO level who are springing into action in many cases to fill the gaps left by governance actors.
That's a good point, isn't it? We are seeing, on an individual level within different war zones, attempts at least for ceasefires. And this may not have to do just with COVID-19, of course. But we've seen attempted ceasefires in many of these areas. We can talk about Syria, for example, as one of them when it comes to Idlib specifically. But there are, of course, other examples, certainly Yemen comes to mind also. Do you think that there's more hope in that, like on an individual case-by-case basis for ceasefires? And then what do you make of then the influence of NGOs and institutes and otherwise who work for peace?
Well, Idlib was actually the example I was going to take, where nowadays people can or have to choose between two opponents. It's either the regime or at least any forces that could harm them, or the virus. And I think this is a situation that nobody should face in the first place. It is really true to say that NGO civil societies became stronger over the past 30 years. And what also evolved over the past 30 years is the type of conflicts we are facing. And in there, we see that more and more non-state actors are really key actors in those conflicts. And non-state actors are not really impacted by what you call geostrategic games at the UN Security Council, are not even bound by, or they do not feel bound by a resolution by the Security Council or by international humanitarian law. So I think those initiatives are really, really positive. Of course, working for Institute Promoting Peace, we are looking for long-standing ceasefire. So I would say cessation of hostilities. That's what we are looking for. But I think that's not what's happening at the moment. We see in several conflicts ceasefires being applied, but what we also see at the same time is reorganization of troops, reorganization of supplies for those troops, and basically preparing for the next phase of combat. And I think this is really disturbing for us at the Institute for Economics and Peace.
I'll give you the final word before I let you both go. What do you make of how you can incentivize peace then, right? Because it's all about that, isn't it? At the end of the day, unfortunately for the world, it's about the dollars and the money, right? We know that there are a lot of countries around the world that make a lot of money through selling arms, for example, around the world to many different actors, be they good actors or bad. That can, of course, be argued. Do you think that there's a way to then incentivize peace on top of that?
Well, you make an excellent point here. It's one of the perversities of our international order that, members of the P5 are the biggest arms producers in the world. And in many ways, they continue to fuel the conflicts that they have responsibility for trying to resolve and dampen. My optimism comes, I think, from ordinary people and from the global opinion, which can see very, very vividly in the current situation that, military weapons, tanks, planes, bombs, guns cannot protect you from a virus. They cannot protect, ordinary people from any of that. And there is no victory to be gained. You might win a war, but if your citizenry are completely devastated by this virus, then you've lost. And I have a feeling that, it may take the virus getting worse, the pandemic getting worse, and starting to affect militaries in particular. When 50% of military groups or militant groups come down with the virus, maybe that will be the point, that there'll be this change of consciousness, a change of perspective, where we might be able to realize. I mean, that is the sad truth of it, because I would have thought that given the current global situation, if anything would cause a recalculation, this would. But it's so kind of sad and disheartening to see that even the great powers and the United Nations are not taking this opportunity.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave it there at that, right, with Richard and Serge. And we do, of course, sincerely appreciate their time. Richard there speaking to us from Dunedin, and Serge speaking to us there from Brussels. I'll be back right after the break, continuing the conversation. Welcome back, viewers. We're continuing to talk about a global ceasefire as proposed by the United Nations Secretary General and then proposed by France and Tunisia. That initial resolution had been rejected, specifically also by the United States because of its mention of the WHO, the World Health Organization. And now we've had another resolution put forth by Estonia and Germany, which is a lot more watered down and has less enforcement capabilities. Now, when we talk about peace, of course, these are all grand terms, aren't there? Because tomorrow, in fact, is the International Day of Living Together in Peace, which sounds very fancy and nice. But let me put that now to our other panelists who are joining us to discuss this topic a bit further. We're joined now by Jean-Marc Rickli, who is the head of the Global Risk and Resilience at Geneva Center for Security Policy. He's joining us now from Geneva. Joining us from Cluj-Napoca in Romania is Brand-Jacobsen, who is the director of the Department of Peace Operations and president of the Romanian Peace Institute. He's the winner of the 2019 Martin Luther King Gandhi Ikeda Lifetime Achievement Award. His work is also subject of a documentary entitled In Pursuit of Peace. Kai and Jean-Marc, thank you both for your time today. Jean-Marc, let me start with you. Again, as I put in my intro there, coming to you, peace is something that it seems very grand a topic, right? The UN talks a lot about peace. Countries around the world talk a lot about peace. But do you think the pandemic really will be the impetus for actual peace and ceasefires?
First of all, when we talk about this global ceasefire, UN ceasefire, it's a UN initiative. That would be a UN initiative. And the UN is comprised of states and reflects, if you want, the geopolitical setting of the post-World War II. And what we've seen since then is the growth on non-state actors. And if you look at developments of conflicts after the Cold War, you see that interstate conflict has reduced, but conflict that are pitting against non-state actors as well as state and non-state actors have not. Actually, they are increasing since the early 2010. And so what we see basically is that it's very difficult to have binding resolution on this group. What this resolution was all about is sending a signal that there was a motivation on behalf of the international community to do something. But eradicating war is probably a dream, but the UN is trying to do its best. But at the end of the day, the UN is a reflection of the national interest of its member, and especially those who are the permanent member of the United Security Council, the 5 permanent members.
So then, Kai, if that's the way to look at this, then, because certainly the UN is made up of its member states, especially the powerful members of the UN Security Council who have veto-wielding power as well, we should be pessimistic then, should we not, that these countries cannot agree upon ceasefires even amidst a pandemic which affects all of the above?
I think rather than pessimistic, we should be realistic. So it's realistic to understand that there are challenges to these countries agreeing, but also that even if they do agree and come up with a resolution, that doesn't necessarily translate to actual ceasefires on the ground. I think, though, that should drive us with greater impetus. It's not enough to have governments or the United Nations calling for this. We need to have media taking up the role you are now to engage print, radio, television media around the world to be calling for a ceasefire. We need to have religious leaders, celebrities, local communities, those who have influence with both governments and non-state actors. We have very rarely seen situations where resolutions coming out of the Security Council have had direct or immediate impact on conflict dynamics. Much more often in reality, it's the result of the dedicated effort and work of people on the ground. So if we want to see ceasefires, the concept of peace should not be something abstract, should not be something idealistic. It's as practical as receiving medical support when you need medical help. We're speaking about bringing about practical actions on the ground in communities affected by conflict. And for that to be achieved, we need a coalition of actors at every single level to be bringing this forward.
Jean-Marc, do you think that at some level, because we had this conversation with other guests just a few moments ago about how we may need to see ceasefires and peace more on a case-by-case basis, that maybe putting this to the UN and that larger platform may not work, where we may need to look at these conflicts one by one? So if we're talking about Syria, for example, we have that ceasefire agreed upon between the Turks and the Russians, specifically when it comes to Idlib. That's just one example. Of course, we can talk about Yemen and others also, of course. Do you think that that's the way to go, where we need to take it case by case? That would, of course, take a lot more time, but do you think that it would be more successful to do it that way?
Well, I don't think it's an either-or approach. I mean, you need to try different approaches. The call for a global ceasefire would not have an effect probably on the ground, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, but it would have a normative impact. That it would send a message that we should try to reduce violence. Then, obviously, for each conflict, you need specific policies and a team that could actually deal with that. Also, what you have to understand is that the nature of conflict is changing, and increasingly what we see in the 21st centuries are what we call surrogate warfare, which is that conflicts and states are no longer fighting directly, but they use surrogates on the ground. And that makes resolution much more difficult to be achieved. We have cases in point currently in Libya where you have Turkey, you have the UAE, you have Russia that have sent troops on the ground, and having an impact to solve this conflict becomes much more complex, because what is missing is the accountability. When you condemn states at the UN, you basically have a direct accountability, whereas if you are using surrogates, if you want, there is a plausible deniability. And we see that also in Yemen and in Syria.
Indeed. So, Kai, in the midst of all this, of course, is the reality that military powers around the world and those who sell military equipment, i.e. a lot of these permanent members of the Security Council will be involved in that sort of thing, that holds a lot of sway and power within these respective countries as lobbying groups as well. So how do we incentivize peace on top of the large amounts of money that are made by selling arms, thus feeding into these sort of conflicts?
It does, absolutely. And I think part of what we need to see on a global level is the recognition of the failure and the bankruptcy of militaristic and aggressive war approaches to addressing conflicts. As Jean-Marc has pointed out, the nature of conflicts and war have been changing in recent years. We actually had a multi-decade decline in incidents of armed violence and deaths caused by armed violence on a global scale, roughly over 30 years, until about 2014. And what we've been seeing since then is the increase in armed conflict worldwide, also driven by an increased legitimization and normalization of war by major powers in the world, including the United States, Russia, China, and others. The fundamental drivers and dynamics of conflict are becoming more intense globally. Unfortunately, our capabilities to address and handle them are not improving at the same speed. We need to have an increased engagement, both by states and non-state actors, on developing intelligent and effective approaches to addressing security challenges. The almost complete illiteracy and lack of understanding on peace building and how to address conflicts effectively on a global scale is astonishing. The challenges we're going to face in the coming years, which the coronavirus is one example of, but there are also many others, the systemic drivers of conflict on a global scale. These will continue to become more intensive. And if we do not build up our capabilities for intelligent and effective solutions and addressing conflicts through peacemaking, peace building, and prevention, then these challenges will only continue to worsen.
All right, so look at just one example, Jean-Marc, just for the sake of specifying something. If we talk about the Israelis and Palestinians, for example, and peace between them, we have this Trump Middle East peace plan, but then the Palestinians haven't really been brought to the fore. I mean, do such approaches work where it's an external actor brought in to apparently mediate, but doesn't really mediate, seemingly, with one side completely left out? I mean, can you force peace upon parties?
Well, in the case of the global plan that is proposed by the Trump administration, as you rightly mentioned, this is not really mediation, because one of the two sides has actually not been consulted in the process, and it's more rather an imposition of one side on the other. This could work, but it works only if you accept that there are winners and there will be losers in international relation. That could work also if we are in a situation where you have a very strong hegemonic power, but as we are seeing the transformation of the international system, especially since the last decade with the rise of China, we can say that the momentum, if you want, of U.S. hegemony is fading away. This momentum that started after the end of the Cold War. And so as the world becomes, some would say, more multipolar, some would say apolar, even bipolar, it's much more difficult to impose a unilateral project situation. So this is possible, but in the current international structure, this is very unlikely.
All right, Kai, I'll give you the word. And I want to come full circle back to the United Nations. The UN body comes under a lot of criticism, right, for the fact that it doesn't have the sort of teeth when it comes to these sort of resolutions, if this one is even passed, really, to enforce it. What do you make of that criticism, the fact that the UN just seems to be a place where people argue, debate, pass a resolution, but then nothing really actually changes? I mean, it seems like a very weak institution, doesn't it?
I think the criticism is misdirected, because when we point the criticism at the United Nations, we're not paying attention to where is the block actually coming from, and that's from the member states of the UN. The UN is a vehicle and a platform. The challenge is not the platform, but the actors engaging with it. If the United States, China, and other countries wish to engage to use the tool and the instruments available through the UN, they would. The real problem lies back in the capitals and in the type of leadership or the complete absence of leadership we're seeing in the world today for addressing the major conflicts, crises, and challenges we're facing. And I want to also circle back to your point earlier in terms of the economic drivers and interests behind war and weapon sales. This is a myth that we need to address because there are those interests, but the economic impact of war is actually destructive and devastating for the overwhelming majority of industries and economic interests in a country, and it sets countries back dramatically. There's actually a tremendous economic incentive for peace, but we have not harvested or harnessed that. And this is part of what we need to do, to bring about a coalition of governments, citizens, companies, and a broad range of actors that recognize we need more intelligent, practical, and effective solutions to addressing conflicts. The UN is an ally in that, but we need to build the coalitions and the practical work for that within our countries and globally as well.
All right, we'll leave it there at that, but conversation, and we do sincerely appreciate the insight and context that you both brought. That was Jean-Marc speaking to us from Geneva and Kai speaking to us from Cluj-Napoca in Romania. Viewers, as all four of our guests throughout the segment, including Serge and Richard earlier, have spoken of, we can look at this in a number of ways, right? When it comes to the ceasefire, there is, as Kai there mentioned towards the end, the incentive towards peace. But then we do also see, as I put the argument to him earlier, about the fact that military arms sales are going up worldwide. And that, at least within many respective countries, creates lobbying groups which then do not want actual peace on the ground. And that creates hurdles, doesn't it, for a proper global ceasefire. Then there is within the UN body then this internal fight between these member states who have differing interests in many of these spaces around the world where there is conflict at this point. And how do they then come to a resolution, to an understanding over a global ceasefire, even amidst a pandemic? Should we all be pessimistic, or is there room for hope? As Richard had earlier said, that there must be hope, because at the end of the day, that's all we have ready to hold on to at this point in time, because peace is spoken of in these very grand terms, even as Serge has said, but it's time now to actually start implementing it on the ground, case by case and or on a global level. All of the above approaches need to work hand in hand together towards that goal, be it temporary right now or be it more long-term or medium-term. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Islamophobia in Canada in a very specific context. We've seen a lot of hate coming out ever since. Certain cities across Canada have announced that they will allow for the call to prayer to ring out at very specific times, mainly the evening call to prayer, because this is the month of Ramadan, as you well know, around the world, where Muslims observe a fast from dawn to dusk. Dusk to dawn, I should say, pardon me. At this point in time, we have within Canada, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, people staying at home and obviously observing social distancing, and they're not then attending mosques. So to ease, again, the issues within Ramadan for Muslims in specific areas around different cities, such as Toronto or otherwise, there have been certain noise bylaws either eased and or extended to include mosques as well as exemptions from that, again, just within very specific times in those places. Now, the backlash has been in some ways expected, but in some ways not expected, because some of the excuses that have been used against this are quite alarming in some ways, where even PTSD has been brought up for those who have served in the Middle East, in wars in the Middle East, that is more specifically, or others such as why exactly would a mosque or mosques be exempt from noise bylaws. At the same time, though, one must remember that church bells do ring out in certain places in Canada as well. So this is a country which is, of course, multicultural, and it's not exactly a Muslim takeover. It's just an extension of a tolerant, harmonious society, as has been argued by many politicians and others in Canada at this time. Let's discuss all of that a bit further and try to dissect that entire issue. We're joined now by Mustafa Amin Farooq, who is the Executive Director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. He's joining us this morning from Ottawa. And joining us from Toronto is Faisal Kutty, who is a law professor at Barry University and Osgood Hall Law School of York University and Counsel to Kutty and Associates law firm. Faisal and Mustafa, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Faisal, let me start with you. You wrote an article about this as well in the Middle East Eye. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the reactions that you saw and coming out once the call to prayer was announced. This entire exemption was announced for those mosques. You detail that, of course, at the beginning, where you say that you almost expected this sort of negative reaction.
Yes, I mean, good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Ramadan Kareem to all of you, first of all. First of all, the Canadian society, as you mentioned in your intro, is very pluralistic. Majority of people had no issue with this, and that was expected. In fact, many in the majority community are the ones who kind of supported and, made this happen. The reaction comes from a small segment of Canadian society, which has been after promoting hatred against the Muslim community. So we have various factions we expected it from the white supremacist community. We expected it from self-proclaimed, quote-unquote, moderate Muslims, who I really call, I refer to them as Uncle Mo's, very similar to the Uncle Toms in the African-American context when blacks were trying to do things that pleased the slave owners, or brown sahibs in the Indo-Pakistani context in the colonial era, where these brown people were trying to satisfy what the colonial powers wanted. So we have what are known as Uncle Mo's in the very extreme secular fanatical Muslim community here. But I expected it from those two. But I didn't expect so much of this from who I believe are supporters, or many of us believe are supporters of the Hindutva movement, who have used this now along, teaming up with members of the fringe Coptic Christian community. Again, majority of Christians, majority of Hindus are not against this, but these segments of these two communities have come together to mobilize and use this and give the appearance that this exemption or this easing of noise control is only given for the Muslim community, number one, which is false, as you indicated in your intro. Secondly, they've made it look like it's 5 daily prayers. If you read all of the hate that's coming from these groups, they give the impression that this is for 5 daily prayers. It's these long, loud adans, and it's like basically the takeover or basically Islamification of Canada, which is false. And so this is now leading to some people in the majority community being confused and saying, hey, is this what's happening here? And so this is what I see happening, and we need to fight back, and members of the Muslim community, members of the broader Canadian community, anti-hate communities are coming forward and coming together and trying to oppose this.
Mustafa, I wanted to ask you a very basic question first, because the argument seems to be that why exactly should the Muslim community get this exemption? What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, I think the reason for that is actually quite clear and simple. The reality is that under the Charter, all citizens are guaranteed the right under Section 2 to religious equality. So, I mean, whether you're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or you don't have any faith, and you just have other beliefs, you should feel free to practice those from a principled perspective in Canada or wherever you live. The reality is that for folks that are living peacefully and not bothering anyone, they should be free to practice their religious rights, whether that's ringing of the church bells, whether that's the blowing of the shofar, whether that's the calling of the call to prayer, the adhan. And I think that's relatively straightforward. I think the vast majority of folks, as I think Professor Faisal Kutty rightly pointed out, don't really have a problem with that. That's why for many folks, when they hear it, they call it something beautiful. They appreciate other folks' cultures and religions, and it really is a moment to come together. Unfortunately, there are these small but very vocal group of sort of far extremists who are taking some issues with it.
Faisal, as someone up in Toronto, and I've been around the Islamic Center of Toronto, especially, which is one of the mosques where this call to prayer is being heard from. I wonder, do you think that what we're seeing now from some of these groups, of course, these very fringe groups, is that because we are now in this coronavirus pandemic, and do you think that that's the context of all this, where it's not just, of course, hatred towards Muslims in the overall picture, but it's been hatred towards East Asian, or Canadians of East Asian descent, I should say, or others at this point in time, where it's just almost lashing out at just the other?
That's a good question, but I don't think so. I mean, that aspect of it comes from the white supremacists, as I said, but really most vocal opposition here is coming from, as I said, supporters of the Hindutva movement who've organized here, and they see this as a way to target the Muslim community. Because, for them, they can have the exemptions. It's funny, if you watch the chats in these groups, the Coptic Christian groups and fringe groups and the Hindutva movement supporters here, you see them saying, we're okay to get Diwali exemptions for fireworks and the Coptic Christian exemptions for their events, but these Muslims, they're the problem here because they're going to Islamize the country. So really, I think they're importing old world hatreds here to use that to now confuse that issue and then try to win support from the white supremacists. And they've all tagged along here. The four groups I mentioned here have come together, but primarily at the current moment for this Adhan issue, it's really led by, as I said, the supporters of the Hindutva movement here, and we're actually digging up more information on that, as well as the fringe Coptic Christians. To add to what Mustafa noted, really, it's in Canada we have a secularism which is very different from the secular fanaticism that we see in France, for instance, or even in Quebec here, in the province of Quebec. The secularism we see in the rest of Canada and the United States primarily is really a neutral, religious neutral kind of secularism. So I didn't really expect so much of that to pick up here. But because these groups are really vocal, they're organized, and they're raising money. If you go on their Facebook group, they're trying to raise money to do a constitutional challenge, which is really ridiculous. A constitutional challenge for what? Against what, Mustafa mentioned. The charter allows every single group the same way, whether you're religious or non-religious, you're entitled to some accommodation, and our democratically elected leaders can give exemptions and can give certain things within the confines of the Constitution. So what are you going to challenge that? I mean, but they will end up doing this and then create trouble for Muslims and others by, making it look like, hey, they're giving favoritism to the Muslims, when in fact that's not the reality at all.
All right, so I'll give you a word then, Mustafa, before I let you both go. What do you think, or what should Muslims be calling for, Canadian Muslims be calling for at this time? And we do have support by the vast majority of Canadian politicians and others, as you both have mentioned at this point. So do you think that it's simply a question of ignoring this and letting this go, or does this need to be dealt with in a lot stricter a fashion?
So, I think there's two things. I think, first of all, everyone is entitled to live free of hate and free of discrimination. So when folks are posting online about, how Canadian Muslims need to go back to their countries of origin, how we're not welcome, I think that needs to be condemned, and it needs to be condemned at the highest levels. That kind of rhetoric needs to stop. And I think it's also an important conversation around what can the Canadian government do to discourage racism, to discourage anti-Semitism, to discourage all forms of virulent hate. So from a structural perspective, that needs to happen. But what I would say is that during this current pandemic, yes, of course, the Canadian Muslim community is entitled to accommodation, and we at the National Council of Canadian Muslims will fight to defend the rights of Canadian Muslims and other marginalized groups. But it's also a moment for deep reflection, and a moment, especially during Ramadan, this month of fasting, this month of charity, to find out what you can do to help your neighbors. And that would be the message that we would send out to our folks. Take the time to think about, okay, there might be people in our community who don't like us. That's fine. We're going to, of course, resist that discourse. But at the same time, we're going to respond with love We're going to respond by making sure that people are fed, by making sure people are clothed, by making sure people don't go hungry.
Very well. Well, that, but we do sincerely appreciate both Mustafa and Faisal for their time this morning and for providing us the context that we needed to understand better the situation there within Canada when it comes to specifically the quote-unquote controversy that is surrounding currently the call to prayer in some Canadian cities that's been allowed there by officials within, again, the context of a Ramadan during the coronavirus pandemic, where because of social distancing and quarantines and lockdowns, people are not being able to attend mosques directly. And again, it's not 5 times a day where this call to prayers is being heard. It's just specifically for the evening prayers where essentially the fast is being broken at that time, right at sunset, that this call to prayer is taking place. And again, it's within very specific neighborhoods as well. But again, what this brings up is those fringe groups, as Faisal there was describing. It's from the white supremacists you expect it, right? Because this sort of Islamophobia on their part has been growing. But again, within this context would be expected. However, it is the Hindutva groups, as he outlined, which are the most concerning, that they seem to be bringing their old hatred back into Canada at this point in time and trying to, revive that within the context of a country which is multicultural, where people live side by side, people of differing faiths live side by side and practice their faiths side by side as well. So again, a disturbing trend, certainly at this point. The majority of Canadians, certainly at this point, seemingly according to both of our guests, accept and are okay with this, and some even find this a good move on the part of Canadian officials. Nevertheless, officials also need to deal with the hate that we're seeing online, on social media, especially what continues to be an issue for countries around the world as well, not less Canada as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks.